when 34-year-old cattle rancher Daniel Blackwood placed the winning bid of $847 on 22-year-old Iris McKenna at the Clearwater County debt auction, the entire town expected another tragedy in the making. What they witnessed instead was the most shocking business decision in the county's 150-year history, one that would transform two broken lives and challenge everything this small Montana community thought they knew about worth, dignity, and second chances. The autumn wind carried the smell of desperation across Clearwater County's courthouse steps that Tuesday morning in October 2019. Iris McKenna stood barefoot on the weathered wooden platform, her ankles bound by invisible chains of debt that had accumulated like snow in a Montana winter, slow, steady, and eventually overwhelming. The faded denim dress she wore had once belonged to her mother, back when hope still lived in the McKenna household, back before medical bills and predatory loans had devoured everything they'd ever built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Judge Harrison's voice boomed across. The gathered crowd of maybe 60 people, most of them locals, who'd come more out of morbid curiosity than genuine interest in bidding. This was Clearwater County's first debt auction in over a decade. A legal relic that most folks assumed had died with the Great Depression. But Montana state law still allowed for indentured servitude contracts when traditional bankruptcy failed to satisfy creditors, and Iris McKenna's situation had pushed every legal boundary until this archaic option became the only path forward. Her story had been front-page news in the Clearwater Gazette for 3 weeks running. 22 years old, orphaned at 16 when her parents died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver, Iris had spent the last 6 years caring for her paralyzed younger brother Tommy while drowning in the medical debt that their parents' inadequate insurance had left behind. Physical therapy, specialized equipment, round-the-clock care. The bills had mounted like an avalanche, and when Tommy finally lost his battle with complications from spinal injuries 8 months ago, Iris found herself alone with $127,000 in medical debt and no way to pay it. The bank had already seized their family ranch. The medical collection agencies had garnished her wages from 3 different jobs until she couldn't afford rent on even the smallest apartment in town. Legal aid had exhausted every option, every program, every possible avenue for relief. The debt auction was literally her last choice before complete destitution and homelessness, a way to work off her obligations through a court-supervised labor contract that would at least guarantee food and shelter while she paid down what she owed. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the legal documents that would effectively transfer ownership of another human being's labor for the next 7 years. Miss McKenna's contract includes full debt assumption by the winning bidder, with labor compensation applied at federal minimum wage standards toward the principal balance. The term of service is calculated at 6 years and 4 months, assuming standard working conditions and no additional penalties or fees. The crowd murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disgust, others calculating whether the arrangement might benefit their own struggling businesses. Clearwater County had been hemorrhaging population for 15 years as young people fled to bigger cities with better opportunities. Farms were failing, small businesses were closing, and those who remained were often barely scraping by themselves. The idea of acquiring guaranteed labor, even at the cost of assuming someone else's debt, held a certain desperate appeal for people who were drowning in their own financial struggles. Iris kept her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere above the crowd's heads, trying to maintain what little dignity remained available to her. She'd made peace with this decision weeks ago, after her 3rd eviction notice and her 2nd trip to the food bank in the same week. This wasn't what she'd planned when she'd graduated valedictorian from Clearwater High School, when she'd received that full scholarship to Montana State University that she'd had to turn down to care for Tommy. But life had a way of stripping away plans like paint from an old barn, leaving only the raw wood underneath to weather whatever storms came next. The bidding started at $200, offered half-heartedly by Jim Peterson, who owned the struggling hardware store on Main Street. Peterson had been hemorrhaging money since the new Walmart opened in the county seat 40 miles away, and his wife had been after him to find cheaper help for inventory and customer service. But his bid lacked conviction, more of a social obligation than genuine interest. "I hear $300, called out Martha Reynolds, who ran the town's only diner and had been working 16-hour days since her cook quit to take a job at the new casino. Martha's bid carried more weight. Everyone knew she was serious about business, and her diner was one of the few establishments in town that still turned a consistent profit. The price climbed slowly, reluctantly, as if each bidder was wrestling with their own conscience. $400 from the owner of the town's small medical clinic, who needed help with filing and patient care. $475 from the proprietor of the feed store, who was drowning in paperwork and inventory management. Each bid represented not just money, but years of Iris McKenna's life, years she would spend working to pay off debts that had never been her fault in the first place. As the bidding approached $600, something shifted in the crowd. The casual observers began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about in Clearwater County for generations to come. Cell phones emerged from pockets as people began recording, some with obvious discomfort, others with the kind of morbid fascination that draws crowds to accidents and disasters. Iris felt the weight of those stares, the whispered conversations, the judgment that hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. She thought about her parents, about what they would think if they could see her now. She thought about Tommy, who'd spent his final months apologizing for the burden his care had placed on their family, as if love could ever be a burden, as if caring for the people you love could ever be anything but a privilege and an honor. That's when she saw him for the first time, standing at the back of the crowd like a shadow given form. Daniel Blackwood wasn't a tall man, maybe 5'10", but he carried himself with the kind of quiet presence that comes from years of hard work and harder decisions. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses and scars that marked him as someone who'd never been afraid to bleed for what he believed in. He wore a simple black coat over worn jeans and boots that had seen more honest work than most people's entire wardrobes. Daniel had been standing there for the entire auction, watching with an expression that was impossible to read. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't given any indication that he was there for anything other than morbid curiosity. But something in his posture, something in the way he held his shoulders, suggested a man wrestling with a decision that would define the rest of his life. The Blackwood Ranch had been in Daniel's family for 4 generations, 2,800 acres of prime cattle country that had once supported a herd of over 500 head and employed a dozen ranch hands. But the last 5 years had been catastrophic for small ranchers throughout Montana. Drought had decimated the grazing land. Beef prices had fluctuated, widely due to trade wars and market manipulation by corporate agriculture. A devastating fire in 2017 had destroyed nearly half his infrastructure, and insurance had covered barely 60% of the rebuilding costs. Daniel was down to 127 head of cattle and no employees except himself. The bank was breathing down, his neck about missed mortgage payments, and he'd already sold off 400 acres to a development company just to keep the creditors at bay. He was 34 years old and facing the very real possibility that he would be the Blackwood who lost everything his great-grandfather had built from nothing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. But Daniel's presence at the auction wasn't about acquiring cheap labor for his struggling ranch. He'd grown up hearing stories about his great-great-grandmother, Sarah Blackwood, who'd been sold into indentured servitude in Ireland before making her way to Montana in the 1890s. Sarah had worked 7 years to pay off her passage to America, 7 years during which she was treated as property rather than a person. When she'd finally earned her freedom, she'd sworn that no member of her family would ever allow such injustice to flourish if they had the power to prevent it. Daniel had inherited more than land from his ancestors. He'd inherited their sense of moral obligation, their understanding that some things mattered more than money, more than comfort, more than personal convenience. Watching Iris McKenna stand on that platform, seeing the resignation in her posture and the quiet dignity with which she faced her circumstances, Daniel felt the weight of 4 generations of Blackwood values pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. The bidding had reached 750s, with Martha Reynolds and the medical clinic owner engaged in a reluctant back and forth that suggested neither of them really wanted to win. Each bid came slower than the last, as if the bidders were hoping someone else would step forward and relieve them of this uncomfortable responsibility. $750 going once, Judge Harrison called out, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority and personal discomfort. Harrison had been presiding over Clearwater County legal proceedings for 18 years, and he'd never imagined he would be conducting a debt auction in the 21st century. The whole proceeding felt like a relic from a darker time, a reminder of how quickly civilized society could revert to its most primitive instincts when economic desperation reached a certain threshold. $750 going twice, the judge continued, scanning the crowd for any last-minute bidders. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility and regret, the kind of silence that precedes life-changing decisions and irreversible consequences. That's when Daniel Blackwood stepped forward, his voice cutting through the autumn air, like a blade through silk. $847, he said, his tone steady and clear, carrying across the courthouse steps with the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty. The crowd turned as one, dozens of heads swiveling to identify this unexpected bidder who'd remained silent throughout the entire proceeding. Iris McKenna looked up for the first time since the auction had begun, her green eyes meeting Daniel's brown ones across the space that separated their 2 very different kinds of desperation. Daniel had chosen 840 settlers for a specific reason, though. He would never explain it to anyone except Iris herself. It was exactly $127 more than the previous bid, representing the $127,000 in medical debt that had destroyed her life. It was his way of acknowledging that he understood the full scope of what had brought her to this moment, and that he was prepared to bear the weight of that understanding, along with the financial obligation he was assuming. Judge Harrison blinked in surprise, consulting his paperwork to ensure he'd heard correctly. $847 is the bid. Do I hear any other bids? He waited the customary 30 seconds, scanning the crowd for any last-minute challenges to Daniel's offer. None came. Martha Reynolds shook her head and stepped back, recognizing something in Daniel's posture that suggested this was no longer a business transaction, but something far more personal and profound. $847 going once, the judge called out. Going twice. He raised his gavel, the wooden hammer that would seal Iris McKenna's fate for the next 6 years and 4 months. Sold to Daniel Blackwood of the Blackwood Ranch for $847. The gavel fell, with a sound like thunder, echoing across the courthouse steps and reverberating through the lives of everyone present. In that moment, Iris McKenna legally became the property of Daniel Blackwood, her labor and her time belonging to him for over 6 years, her freedom suspended until her debt was satisfied according to the terms of the court-supervised contract. But as the crowd began to disperse and the legal paperwork was prepared for signing, something unprecedented happened. Daniel Blackwood walked directly to the platform where Iris still stood, her hands clasped in front of her face a mask of resigned acceptance. He stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough that only she could hear what he said next. "Miss McKenna," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to surprise even him. "My name is Daniel Blackwood. I know you don't know me, and you have no reason to trust me. But I want you to understand something right now, before we sign any papers or make any legal commitments." Iris looked up at him, searching his face for signs of the kind of predatory intentions she'd learned to recognize in the men who'd approached her family during Tommy's illness, the ones who'd offered help that always came with strings attached, the ones who'd seen her desperation as an opportunity for exploitation. What she saw instead was something she hadn't expected, a man who looked as uncomfortable with this situation as she felt, a man whose eyes held the same kind of bone-deep weariness that she saw in her own mirror every morning. This wasn't a man who was celebrating his acquisition of human property. This was a man who looked like he'd just made the most difficult decision of his life. "I didn't bid on you because I need cheap labor," Daniel continued, his voice so low that even the lingering reporters couldn't overhear. "I didn't bid on you because I see you as property or as something to be owned. I bid on you because what's happening here is wrong, and I have the means to stop it, at least for you." Iris felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of despair that had taken up permanent residence beneath her ribs. "I don't understand," she whispered. Daniel glanced around at the dispersing crowd, at the reporters packing up their equipment, at Judge Harrison organizing the legal paperwork that would formalize their arrangement. "We'll talk more when we get to the ranch," he said. "But I want you to know that whatever happens next, it's going to be your choice. The contract might say I own your labor, but I don't own you. Nobody owns you. And I'm going to spend every day of the next 6 years making sure you remember that." As they walked toward Daniel's pickup truck, a weathered Ford F-250 that had seen better decades, but still ran like the day it rolled off the assembly line, Iris felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 years, curiosity about the future. She didn't know what Daniel Blackwood's true intentions were, didn't know what kind of life awaited her at the Blackwood Ranch, didn't know whether his words were genuine or just another form of manipulation wrapped in prettier packaging. But for the first time since Tommy's death, she felt like she might have a choice in what happened next. And that feeling, fragile as a soap bubble and just as likely to burst, was enough to keep her walking forward, instead of looking back at the courthouse steps where her old life had officially ended and something entirely new had begun. The drive to Blackwood Ranch took 43 minutes through winding mountain roads that seemed designed to test both vehicles and nerves. Iris sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's pickup truck, watching the Montana landscape roll past her window like scenes from someone else's life. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried the weight of two people, trying to figure out how to navigate a situation that neither of them had ever imagined they'd find themselves in. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but Iris could sense him stealing glances at her from time to time, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that had too many missing pieces. She studied his profile when she thought he wasn't paying attention, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel, the small scar that ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone. This was a man who'd been through his own battles, fought his own wars, and emerged scarred but not broken. The radio played softly between them, classic country music that seemed to match the rhythm of the truck's engine and the steady thrum of tires. On asphalt. When Patsy Cline's voice filled the cab singing Crazy, Iris found herself thinking about how accurately that word described her current situation. 3 hours ago, she'd been facing the prospect of 7 years of indentured servitude to pay off debts that had never been her fault. Now she was riding shotgun with a complete stranger who'd paid nearly $1,000 for the legal right to control her life. And somehow she felt safer than she had in months. As they turned off the main highway onto a gravel road marked by a weathered wooden sign reading Blackwood Ranch, Est 1887, Daniel finally broke the silence that had stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. "I want to explain something to you before we get to the house," he said, his voice careful and measured. "What happened back there at the courthouse, what I did. I know how it must look to you. I know you're probably wondering what kind of man pays money to legally own another human being, even if it's supposed to be temporary and legal." Iris turned to face him fully for the first time since they'd left town. "I've been wondering about that, yes," she admitted. "In my experience, men don't spend money on women without expecting something in return, usually something the woman doesn't want to give." Daniel's jaw tightened, and she saw something flash across his features that might have been anger, but not at her. "I'm not those men," he said quietly, "and I need you to understand something right from the start. The contract that Judge Harrison filed today says you owe me 6 years and 4 months of labor. But as far as I'm concerned, that contract is just a piece of paper that kept you from ending up somewhere a lot worse than my ranch." The truck rounded a bend in the gravel road, and suddenly the Blackwood Ranch spread out before them like something from a postcard. The main house was a 2-story log structure that had been built to last generations, with a wraparound porch and windows that reflected the late afternoon sun like gold. Beyond the house, Iris could see a red barn that looked like it had been recently repaired, several smaller outbuildings, and pastures that stretched toward the mountains in the distance where cattle grazed in the golden autumn light. But even from a distance, she could see signs of the struggle that Daniel had alluded to. Sections of fence that needed repair, equipment that looked older than it should be, and most tellingly, the vast emptiness of pastures that should have been filled with more cattle than the small herd she could see scattered across the nearest. "The field. It's beautiful," Iris said, and meant it. After months of living in cramped apartments and homeless shelters, the open space felt like being able to breathe again. "It was," Daniel replied, and she heard a note of loss in his voice that resonated with her own experience of watching everything important slip away, despite your best efforts to hold on. "My great-grandfather built the main house in 1887 with logs he cut himself from trees that grew on this land. 4 generations of Blackwoods have worked this ranch, raised their families here, buried their dead in the family cemetery beyond that ridge. He pulled the truck up to the main house and turned off the engine, but made no move to get out. Instead, he turned to face Iris directly, his brown eyes serious and intent. "The ranch is failing," he said bluntly. "I'm going to lose it within the next 2 years, unless I can figure out a way to turn things around. I've got 127 head of cattle when I should have 500. I'm behind on mortgage payments, equipment loans, and property taxes. The bank is being patient with me because my family has been good customers for over a century, but patience only stretches so far." Iris felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She'd heard variations of this speech before, usually followed by requests for favors or sacrifices that she couldn't afford to make. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked. "Everything," Daniel said. "Because I have an idea that could save both of us, but it's going to require you to trust me in ways that probably don't make sense, given how we met." He opened his door and stepped out of the truck, walking around to open her door before she could do it herself. The gesture was so automatic, so ingrained, that she realized it probably wasn't performed for her benefit, but simply because that's how Daniel Blackwood had been raised to treat women. There was something oddly comforting about that kind of unconscious courtesy. They walked up the front steps together, and Daniel opened the heavy wooden door to reveal an interior that managed to be both rustic and welcoming. The main room featured exposed log walls, hardwood floors that had been worn smooth by generations of boots, and furniture that looked handmade and built to last. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Iris could see through to a kitchen that looked like it had been designed by someone who actually cooked rather than just heated up frozen dinners. "This is home," Daniel said simply. "Has been for my family for 132 years, and I'd like it to be your home too, for as long as you want it to be." Iris set down the single duffel bag that contained everything she owned in the world and looked around the room. It was bigger than any place she'd lived since her parents died, cleaner than anywhere she'd been able to afford in the last 2 years, and filled with the kind of solid, permanent furniture that spoke of stability and generations of family history. "Where do you want me to sleep?" she asked, because in her experience that was always the first question that needed to be answered when dealing with men who'd acquired power over her circumstances. Daniel pointed toward a staircase that led to the second floor. "There are 4 bedrooms upstairs. You can have your pick of any of them, except the master bedroom, which is mine. Each room has its own lock, and you'll be the only one with keys to whichever room you choose." The relief that flooded through Iris was so intense that she had to sit down on the nearest chair to keep her knees from giving out. In every other situation she'd faced over the last 2 years, sleeping arrangements had been either communal, temporary, or came with expectations that made her skin crawl. The idea of having her own space, her own lock, her own sanctuary, was almost too good to believe. "What's the catch?" she asked, because there was always a catch. Daniel walked over to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, moving with the easy confidence of a man who was completely comfortable in his own space. "The catch is that I need your help with something that's either going to save this ranch or finish destroying it," he said. "And if it goes wrong, we'll both end up worse off than we were before we met." He pulled 2 mugs from a cabinet and leaned against the kitchen counter, studying her face as if he was trying to gauge whether she was ready to hear what he had to say next. "Have you ever heard of agritourism?" he asked. Iris shook her head. "Should I have?" "Maybe not. It's a relatively new concept, at least around here. The idea is that instead of just raising cattle and selling beef, ranchers can make money by offering experiences to people who want to get away from city life for a while. Horseback riding, cattle drives, campfire dinners, that sort of thing. Dude ranches, some people call them." Daniel poured coffee into both mugs and handed one to Iris, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. His hands were warm and calloused, the hands of someone who'd spent his life working with them, and she found the contact oddly reassuring. "The problem is," he continued, "I don't know the first thing about hospitality or tourism or dealing with city people who want to play cowboy for a weekend. I'm a rancher. I know cattle and horses and how to fix broken equipment and how to read weather patterns, but I don't know how to make guests feel welcome or how to plan activities or how to cook for people who aren't used to ranch food." Iris took a sip of her coffee and found it stronger and better than anything she'd been able to afford in months. "And you think I do?" "I think you spent 6 years taking care of your brother, which means you know about hospitality and making people comfortable and managing complex schedules and solving problems that don't have easy solutions," Daniel said. "I think you worked 3 jobs while you were doing that, which means you understand customer service and working with people and multitasking under pressure." He set down his mug and walked over to a desk in the corner of the room, returning. With a folder full of papers and photographs. "I've been researching this for months," he said, spreading the contents across the kitchen table. "There are ranches in Colorado and Wyoming that are making 6 figures a year from agritourism. City people pay premium prices to experience what they think is authentic ranch life." Iris looked at the photographs of smiling families on horseback. Group shots around campfires, images of rustic but comfortable guest accommodations. The numbers on the business plans and financial projections were impressive, but they also represented a massive leap from traditional cattle ranching to something that was essentially entertainment and hospitality. "This would be a complete career change for you," she said. "You'd be giving up everything you know how to do to try something you've never done before." "I'd be adapting," Daniel corrected, "using what I know about ranching and this land to create something new. But you're right, that I can't do it alone. I need a partner who understands the hospitality side of things, someone who can handle the guest services while I manage the ranch operations." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down across from her at the table, his expression serious and intent. "Here's what I'm proposing. Instead of you working as my employee for 6 years to pay off your debt, we become business partners, equal partners. You help me turn this ranch into a successful agritourism operation, and in return, you own half of everything we built together." Iris stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. "You want to make me your business partner after knowing me for less than 2 hours? "I want to make you my business partner because I've spent the last 2 hours watching you, and I can see that you're exactly the kind of person who could make this work," Daniel said. "You're careful and observant. You ask the right questions. You don't trust easily, which means you think things through before making decisions. And most importantly, you need this to succeed as much as I do." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "I could have let someone else win that auction today. I could have let you become Martha Reynolds' kitchen help or Jim Peterson's store clerk. But I didn't, because I recognized something in you that I've been looking for without knowing it." "What's that?" "Someone who's been knocked down but not knocked out. Someone who's lost everything but hasn't lost the will to fight for something better." Daniel's voice was quiet but intense. "I think you and I are the same kind of person, Iris. We're survivors. And I think together we might be able to build something that neither of us could manage alone." Iris looked down at the papers scattered across the table, at the photographs of happy families and successful businesses, at the financial projections that suggested the possibility of not just survival, but actual prosperity. It was the kind of opportunity she'd never imagined would be offered to someone in her position, the kind of chance that people like her weren't supposed to get. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked. "What if we try this and fail and lose everything?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Then we failed together," he said finally. "And at least we'll fail trying to build something meaningful instead of just trying to survive." He stood up and walked over to the window that looked out over the ranch, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed at the mountains in the distance. "My great-great-grandmother came to this country as an indentured servant," he said. "She worked 7 years to pay off her passage to America, 7 years during which she was treated as property rather than a person. When she finally earned her freedom, she used every penny she'd managed to save to buy this land." Daniel turned back to face Iris, and she could see the weight of family history in his expression. She always said that the difference between surviving and thriving was having someone believe in your potential even when you couldn't see it yourself. Today, at that courthouse, I saw your potential. I saw someone who'd been beaten down by circumstances but not broken by them. Iris felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself to shed in months. "You don't know me," she whispered. "You don't know what I'm capable of, or whether I'm worth taking a chance on." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted, "but I know that you spent 6 years sacrificing everything to take care of your brother. I know that you worked 3 jobs while managing his medical care. I know that when you were faced with the choice between bankruptcy and indentured servitude, you chose the option that at least guaranteed you could work to pay off debts that were never your fault in the first place. He walked back over to the table and sat down across from her again. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, your work ethic, and your integrity. The rest we can figure out together. Daniel pulled a legal pad from the folder and began sketching out rough plans. Here's what I'm thinking. We spend the next 6 months planning and preparing. Research successful agritourism operations. Figure out what kinds of experiences we want to offer. Start marketing to potential guests. Come spring, we launch with a small number of visitors and see how it goes. His pencil moved across the paper as he talked, drawing rough layouts of guest accommodations, activity areas, dining spaces. We'll need to renovate the old bunkhouse for guest rooms, set up a proper kitchen for group meals, maybe build some kind of pavilion for evening entertainment. It'll take most of our available cash and a lot of sweat equity, but it's doable. Iris found herself leaning forward, studying his sketches, her mind already starting to fill in details and possibilities. What about liability insurance, health department permits, marketing and reservations? Exactly the kinds of questions I need a partner to help me answer, Daniel said with a smile that transformed his entire face. So what do you say, Iris? McKenna, are you willing to bet your next 6 years on the possibility that we can build something extraordinary together? Iris looked around the kitchen, at the solid log walls and handmade furniture, at the windows that framed views of mountains and pastures and endless sky. She thought about the alternative, about 6 years of working off her debt as someone else's employee, about the safety of knowing exactly what was expected of her and exactly how long she'd have to endure it. Then she thought about the possibility Daniel was offering, the chance to be a partner rather than a servant, to build something meaningful rather than just survive, to have a stake in the future rather than just working to pay off the past. I'll need that lock on my bedroom door, she said finally. Daniel's smile widened. Already ordered. Should be installed by tomorrow. And I want everything in writing. Legal partnership papers, profit-sharing agreements, decision-making authority. Clearly defined. Absolutely. I'll call my lawyer first thing Monday morning. Iris took a deep breath, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff with no way of knowing whether she was about to fall or fly. Then yes, she said, let's build something extraordinary together. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that seemed to promise new beginnings, Daniel and Iris sat at the kitchen table planning their impossible dream. Neither of them knew whether they were making the smartest decision of their lives or the biggest mistake, but for the first time in years, both of them felt like they were moving toward something instead of just trying to escape from something else. And in the growing darkness outside, the Blackwood Ranch settled into evening quiet, holding its breath as it waited to see what these 2 unlikely partners would make of their shared future. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the Blackwood Ranch in 3 feet of snow by mid-November and testing every assumption Daniel and Iris had made about their timeline for launching the agritourism venture. What they'd planned as 6 months of preparation suddenly became a race against nature itself, with frozen pipes, impassable roads, and temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero, making even the simplest renovation tasks feel like expeditions. To the Arctic, Iris discovered that living on a working ranch in Montana winter was unlike anything she'd experienced in her 22 years of life. The isolation was complete and absolute when blizzards rolled across the mountains, cutting off power and phone service for days at a time. The work was relentless, with cattle needing to be fed twice daily, regardless of weather conditions, water, systems requiring constant monitoring to prevent freezing, and equipment breaking down at the worst possible moments because metal became brittle in the extreme cold. But she also discovered something unexpected about herself during those long, dark months. The physical labor that had once seemed overwhelming began to feel natural, even satisfying. Her hands grew calloused from wielding hammers and saws, her shoulders broadened from hauling hay bales and feed sacks, and her endurance increased until she could work 14-hour days without the bone-deep exhaustion that had plagued her during her years of juggling multiple jobs in town. More importantly, she found herself genuinely excited about the project. They were building together. Every morning brought new challenges that required creative solutions, and every small victory felt like proof that their impossible dream might actually be achievable. When the old bunkhouse's heating system failed completely in December, forcing them to strip it down to the studs and redesign the entire interior, Iris surprised herself by diving into architectural drawings and construction techniques with an enthusiasm she'd never shown for anything in her previous life. Daniel watched her transformation with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. The frightened, defeated young woman who'd stood on the courthouse steps 3 months ago had been replaced by someone who attacked problems with fierce determination and refused to accept that anything was truly impossible if you were willing to work hard enough and think creatively enough. Their days fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and purposeful. Daniel handled the cattle and the heavy construction work that required years of experience with ranch equipment and building techniques. Iris took charge of the interior renovations, the business planning, and the endless research required to understand what their potential guests would want and expect from their Montana ranch experience. They worked side by side during the daylight, hours planning and building and problem-solving their way through 1,000 small challenges. When darkness fell early in the winter afternoons, they would sit at the kitchen table with coffee and laptops, researching successful agritourism operations across the country and adapting ideas to fit their specific circumstances and limited budget. The evenings became Iris's favorite part of each day. Daniel proved to be an unexpectedly good cook, preparing hearty meals that reminded her of family dinners from her childhood, back when such things had been possible. They would eat together and talk about everything except the obvious tension that was building between them, the growing awareness that their partnership was becoming something more complicated and potentially more dangerous than either of them had originally intended. By January, they had transformed the old bunkhouse into comfortable guest accommodations that could sleep 12 people in 6 double-occupancy rooms. Each room featured handmade furniture that Daniel had crafted during the long winter evenings, quilts that Iris had sewn using patterns she'd learned from watching YouTube videos, and rustic decorations made from materials they'd found around the ranch. The main challenge was creating bathrooms that would meet health department standards while maintaining the authentic ranch atmosphere that would appeal to their target market. Daniel's solution was to install modern plumbing and fixtures but hide them behind rustic wooden panels and vintage hardware that made everything look like it had been there for decades. Iris handled the marketing and reservation systems, spending countless hours learning about search engine optimization, social media marketing, and online booking platforms. She created a website that showcased the ranch's history and natural beauty while promising experiences that city dwellers could only dream about. Trail rides through mountain wilderness, cattle drives where guests could actually help move the herd, campfire dinners under starry skies that weren't dimmed by urban light pollution. Their first major test came in February when a travel blogger from Denver contacted them about visiting the ranch for a weekend to write a review for her popular outdoor adventure website. Sarah Martinez had over 100,000 followers and a reputation for brutally honest assessments of tourist destinations, and her endorsement could make or break their entire venture before it even officially launched. The problem was that they weren't ready. The guest accommodations were finished, but they hadn't actually tested their systems with real visitors. The kitchen equipment was installed but not fully operational. Most critically, they had never actually guided anyone on a trail, ride or organized a cattle drive, or cooked for people who weren't accustomed to ranch life and ranch food. "We should tell her to come back in the spring," Daniel said, pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal. "We need more time to work out the bugs, make sure everything runs smoothly." "We don't have more time," Iris replied, studying their financial projections for the 100th time. "We're already 3 months behind our original timeline because of the weather. If we don't start generating income soon, we won't have enough cash flow to market the business properly for the summer season." She looked up from the laptop screen, her green eyes determined and slightly desperate. "Besides, she's offering to come during the slowest time of year when we can afford to make mistakes. If we wait until we're fully booked with paying guests, any problems we encounter will be disasters instead of learning experiences." Daniel stopped pacing and leaned against the kitchen counter, studying her face with the intensity that she'd learned meant he was working through a complex problem. "You really think we're ready for this?" "I think we're as ready as we're going to be without actually doing it," Iris said. "And I think Sarah Martinez is exactly the kind of challenge we need to prove to ourselves that this whole thing isn't just an elaborate fantasy." The week leading up to Sarah's visit was controlled chaos. Daniel spent 18-hour days making sure every piece of equipment was functioning perfectly, every fence was secure, every potential safety hazard was eliminated. Iris focused on menu planning and activity scheduling, creating a 3-day itinerary that would showcase everything the ranch had to offer without overwhelming their guest or revealing their inexperience. They had their first real argument 2 days before Sarah was scheduled to arrive, when Daniel suggested they should hire temporary help from town to make sure everything went smoothly. "That defeats the entire purpose," Iris said, her voice sharp with frustration. "If we can't handle 1 guest by ourselves, how are we going to manage 12 guests during peak season? This is supposed to be a test of our systems and our abilities, not a performance where we hide behind other people's expertise. And if we fail this test, we don't get a second chance," Daniel shot back. "Sarah Martinez has enough influence to destroy our reputation before we even have one. Maybe it's worth swallowing our pride to make sure we succeed." The argument escalated until they were both saying things they didn't mean, old insecurities and fears bubbling to the surface in ways that had nothing to do with hiring temporary help and everything to do with the pressure they were both feeling as their impossible dream approached its first real test. Iris finally stormed out of the kitchen and walked to the barn, where she spent an hour brushing Daniel's old mare and trying to calm down enough to think rationally. When she returned to the house, she found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, looking defeated and exhausted. "I'm sorry," he said without looking up. "You're right. If we can't do this ourselves, then we're not ready to be in business." "I'm sorry too," Iris replied, sitting down across from him. "I know you're just trying to protect what we've built here, but I need to know that I can actually do this job, not just that we can fake our way through it with enough hired help." Daniel looked up at her and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "You can do this job," he said quietly. "You've already done things in the last 4 months that I wouldn't have thought possible. I trust you completely, Iris. I can't lose this ranch. It's all I have left of my family, and if we fail—" "We won't fail," Iris said, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. "We're going to give Sarah Martinez the best ranch experience she's ever had, and she's going to write a review that brings us more business than we can handle." The contact of their hands, skin against skin, sent electricity shooting up Iris's arm and straight to her heart. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, and she realized he felt it too. This dangerous chemistry that had been building between them all winter, but which neither of them had been willing to acknowledge. She pulled her hand back quickly. But the moment hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that was threatening to burn out of control. Sarah Martinez arrived on a Friday afternoon in February, driving a rented SUV through snow-packed roads that would have deterred most city visitors. She was younger than Iris had expected, maybe 30, with short dark hair and the kind of athletic build that suggested she spent more time hiking mountains than sitting behind a computer. "This place is incredible," Sarah said, as Daniel helped her carry her bags into the main guest room. The drive up here felt like traveling back in time, and that view of the mountains from the front porch is absolutely stunning. Iris felt some of her anxiety ease as she watched Sarah's genuine enthusiasm for the ranch's natural beauty. This wasn't someone looking for problems to write about. This was someone who appreciated the kind of authentic experience they were trying to provide. The first evening went better than either Daniel or Iris had dared to hope. Sarah was fascinated by the ranch's history and asked thoughtful questions about everything from the original homestead buildings to the current cattle operation. Dinner was a success. Grilled steaks from their own beef, roasted vegetables from Iris's winter garden, and homemade bread that Sarah declared was better than anything she'd eaten in Denver's fanciest restaurants. But the real test came the next morning when Daniel saddled 3 horses for their first trail ride into the mountains. Iris had been riding regularly all winter, building her confidence and skills on the gentle mare that Daniel had assigned to her. But guiding a guest through wilderness terrain was entirely different from practicing in the familiar pastures around the ranch. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun, and temperatures just cold enough to make the ride invigorating without being uncomfortable. Daniel led the way on his big gelding, following trails that his family had been using for over a century, pointing out wildlife tracks and explaining the geology of the mountain formations they passed. Iris rode beside Sarah, answering questions about the local ecosystem and sharing stories about the ranch's history that she'd learned during her months of research. She was surprised to discover how natural it felt to be in the role of guide and host, how much she enjoyed sharing knowledge and creating experiences that would become lasting memories for their guests. The trail ride lasted 3 hours and covered terrain that ranged from gentle meadows to challenging mountain paths that required careful attention to footing and weather conditions. Sarah proved to be an experienced rider who appreciated both the beauty of the landscape and the skill required to navigate it safely. "This is exactly what I was hoping for," Sarah told them as they returned to the ranch in the early afternoon. "So many authentic ranch experiences are just theme park versions of the real thing, but this feels genuine. You can tell that this land has been worked and loved by generations of the same family." That evening's cattle drive was the moment when Iris truly understood what they had accomplished together. Daniel had selected a small group of cattle that needed to be moved from one pasture to another, a routine ranch task that became an adventure when experienced by someone who had never worked with livestock before. Sarah was nervous at first, unsure how to position her horse relative to the cattle, uncertain about the commands Daniel was giving her. But Iris found herself naturally stepping into the role of teacher and encourager, helping Sarah understand how to read the cattle's behavior and respond appropriately to their movements. When the last steer had been successfully moved through the gate into the new pasture, Sarah was grinning with an excitement that reminded Iris of children on Christmas morning. "That was incredible," she said, breathless with exhilaration and accomplishment. "I actually helped move cattle. Me, a woman who's lived in cities her entire life, just participated in an authentic cattle drive." As they rode back toward the ranch buildings in the gathering dusk, Iris felt a sense of satisfaction and pride that was entirely new in her experience. They had created something genuinely valuable, something that enriched the lives of the people who experienced it, while preserving and sharing the authentic traditions of Montana ranch life. The final test came that evening when Sarah asked to interview them both for her article. Sitting in the main room of the ranch house, with the fire crackling in the stone fireplace and snow falling softly outside the windows, Iris found herself telling the story of how she and Daniel had met and become partners. She was careful not to reveal the details of the debt auction or the legal circumstances that had brought her to the ranch, but she spoke honestly about finding hope and purpose in an unexpected place, about learning that sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as the worst possible circumstances. "What's next for Blackwood Ranch?" Sarah asked as the interview concluded. Daniel and Iris looked at each other, and in that moment, Iris realized that somewhere during the long winter months of working and planning and building together, they had become something more than business partners. They had become a team, two people who trusted each other completely and shared a vision that was bigger than either of them could have achieved alone. "We're going to keep growing," Iris said, her voice steady and confident. "We're going to show people that authentic ranch experiences still exist, that there are places where you can step away from modern life and connect with something timeless and real." As Sarah packed her bags the next morning, preparing to return to Denver and write the review that would determine their future, she pulled Iris aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know that what you and Daniel have created here is special," Sarah said. "I visited dozens of ranch operations, and most of them feel like businesses pretending to be ranches. This feels like a ranch that happens to welcome guests. That authenticity is rare and valuable, and I think you're going to be very successful." After Sarah's SUV disappeared down the snowy road, Daniel and Iris stood on the front porch, looking out at the mountains and the pastures where their cattle grazed peacefully in the winter sun. "Do you think we passed the test?" Daniel asked. "I think we did more than pass," Iris replied. "I think we proved to ourselves that we can actually make this work." As they turned to go back into the house, Daniel caught her hand in his, stopping her at the threshold. "Iris," he said, his voice quiet and serious, "I need you to know something. Whatever happens with the business, whatever Sarah writes in her review, these last few months working with you have been the best months of my life." Iris felt her heart skip a beat as she looked into his eyes and saw something there that made her realize their partnership was about to become something even more complicated and potentially wonderful than either of them had ever imagined. Sarah Martinez's review went live on her blog 3 weeks after her visit, and within hours, the Blackwood Ranch website crashed from the overwhelming traffic. Her article, titled "The Last Real Ranch in America," painted their operation as a hidden gem that offered authentic experiences impossible to find anywhere else in the country. She described Iris as a natural host with an intuitive understanding of what makes guests feel genuinely welcome, and Daniel as the kind of rancher who embodies 4 generations of Montana tradition while embracing necessary change. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Their phone rang constantly with booking requests, their email inbox filled with inquiries from potential guests, and their reservation calendar went from completely empty to fully booked through September within a week. What should have been the moment of triumph they'd worked toward all winter instead became the beginning of their greatest challenge. The problem wasn't success. It was the speed and scale of that success. They'd planned to gradually build their guest capacity over the course of their first summer, learning and adjusting their systems as they gained experience with small groups of visitors. Instead, they were suddenly facing the prospect of hosting 12 guests every week for 6 months straight. with no time to ease into the role and no room for the kind of mistakes that are inevitable when launching any new business. Daniel threw himself into preparation with the kind of manic energy that Iris recognized as barely controlled panic. He worked 18-hour days expanding their horse herd, upgrading equipment, and preparing infrastructure that should have been spread out over years instead of compressed into a few weeks. She watched him push himself to exhaustion day after day, refusing to admit that they might have taken on more than they could handle. Iris tried to focus on the operational side of their expansion, creating detailed schedules and systems for managing multiple groups of guests simultaneously. But she also found herself battling a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with business logistics and everything to do with the way Daniel had started looking at her differently since that moment on the front porch when he'd admitted that working with her had been the best months of his life. The romantic tension that had been building between them all winter was becoming impossible to ignore, and Iris found herself caught between wanting to explore those feelings and fearing that mixing business with personal relationships would destroy everything they'd worked so hard to build. She'd seen too many partnerships fall apart when emotions got involved, had watched too many dreams die because people couldn't separate their personal feelings from their professional responsibilities. The first crack in their carefully constructed facade appeared in early April when Daniel hired Jake Morrison, a local ranch hand who'd worked for several operations in the valley and had experience with guest services. Jake was everything that Daniel wasn't: smooth, charming, comfortable with small talk and social situations that made Daniel withdraw into himself. He was also obviously attracted to Iris from the moment he met her, and he wasn't subtle about making his interest known. "You're wasting your talents stuck way out here," Jake told Iris one afternoon as they worked together to prepare the guest dining area for their first group of visitors. "A woman with your skills could be running hospitality operations at major resorts, making real money instead of splitting profits from a two-bit ranch operation." Iris bristled at his casual dismissal of everything she and Daniel had built together. "This isn't a two-bit operation," she said firmly. "We're providing something authentic and meaningful that you can't find at any resort." Jake laughed, but not in a way that suggested he found her comment amusing. "Authentic? You mean like pretending that a debt auction slave is really a business partner? Come on, Iris. The whole town knows what really happened at that courthouse. Daniel bought you and now he's playing dress-up by calling you his partner." The words hit Iris like a physical blow, not because they contained any truth she hadn't already wrestled with, but because they revealed how their relationship was perceived by the community around them. No matter how genuine their partnership had become, no matter how much they'd accomplished together, there would always be people who saw her as nothing more than Daniel's property, dressed up in prettier packaging. That evening, Iris confronted Daniel about Jake's comments, and their conversation quickly escalated into the kind of argument that reveals all the fears and insecurities that people have been hiding from each other. "Maybe Jake's right," Iris said, pacing around the kitchen while Daniel sat at the table looking exhausted and defensive. "Maybe I'm just fooling myself about what this partnership really means. Maybe I'm just a more comfortable version of indentured servitude, and I'm too grateful for the illusion of equality to see the truth." Daniel's face went white with anger, not at her, but at the implication that he would manipulate and deceive someone who trusted him. "Is that really what you think?" he asked, his voice dangerous and quiet. "That everything we've built together is just an elaborate lie? That I've been playing some kind of long game to keep you trapped here?" "I don't know what to think," Iris admitted, her own anger and confusion spilling out in ways she couldn't control. "I know that legally, I still owe you 6 years of labor. I know that no matter what you call me, the state of Montana considers me your indentured servant until that debt is satisfied. And I know that if this business fails, I'll still be obligated to work for you, even if there's nothing left to work for." The legal reality of their situation hung between them like a toxic cloud. No matter how genuine their partnership felt on a day-to-day basis, the underlying structure of their relationship was still based on a contract that defined Iris as property rather than an equal. Daniel had never used that legal authority to control or manipulate her, but the potential for abuse was always there, hidden beneath the surface of their collaboration. "What do you want me to do?" Daniel asked, his voice raw with frustration and something that might have been heartbreak. "Do you want me to tear up the contract, release you from any legal obligation? Because I'll do that right now if it means you'll stop looking at me like I'm some kind of predator who's been taking advantage of your desperation." Iris stopped pacing and stared at him, suddenly understanding that they'd reached a crisis point that would determine not just the future of their business, but the nature of their relationship going forward. "I want to know that you see me as an equal," she said quietly. "Not as someone you rescued, not as someone who owes you gratitude for not being worse than you could have been, but as someone who brings as much value to this partnership as you do." "You bring more value than I do," Daniel said, standing up from the table and walking toward her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You're the reason this business is going to succeed. You're the reason I've been able to imagine a future that's better than just surviving from one season to the next. You're the reason I wake up every morning excited about what we're building, instead of just dreading another day of watching everything fall apart." He stopped just inches away from her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and desperation in his eyes, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "And you're the reason I've been lying awake at night trying to figure out how to tell you that I'm in love with you without destroying everything we've worked for." The confession hung in the air between them like a lit fuse, dangerous and inevitable, and about to explode everything they thought they understood about their relationship. Iris felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized that the feelings she'd been fighting all winter weren't one-sided, that the growing attraction and emotional connection she'd been trying to deny was mutual and powerful and terrifying in its implications. Before she could respond, before either of them could fully process what Daniel had just admitted, the kitchen door burst open and Jake Morrison stumbled in, obviously drunk and clearly angry about something that had happened in town. Well, Jake slurred, looking back and forth between Daniel and Iris with a knowing smirk that made Iris's skin crawl. "Looks like I interrupted something intimate. Should I come back later, or do you want to finish your little romantic scene in front of an audience?" Daniel's entire body went rigid with barely controlled fury. "Get out," he said, his voice so low and dangerous that even Jake seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. "Relax, boss," Jake said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just here to let you know that your little secret is out. The whole town's talking about how Daniel Blackwood is playing house with his auction slave, pretending she's his business partner while he takes advantage of her legal obligation to stay here and service his needs." The crude implication in Jake's words was the final straw. Daniel moved faster than Iris had ever seen him move, crossing the kitchen in 2 strides and grabbing Jake by the front of his shirt. "Say another word," Daniel growled, "and I'll throw you off this ranch so hard you'll bounce." But the damage was already done. Jake's drunken rambling had confirmed Iris's worst fears about how their relationship was perceived by the outside world, and it had poisoned the moment when Daniel had finally admitted his feelings for her. Instead of being able to explore what his confession meant for their future, they were both left dealing with the ugly reality of small-town gossip and the way their unusual partnership was being twisted into something sordid and exploitative. After Daniel threw Jake off the ranch with instructions never to return, he and Iris found themselves facing each other across the kitchen with the weight of unspoken feelings and unresolved conflicts pressing down on them like a physical force. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Iris said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is why I've been trying to keep things professional between us, because the moment we cross that line, everything we've built becomes suspect. People will say that I'm sleeping with you to secure my position, or that you're taking advantage of your legal authority over me to get what you want." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, looking older and more defeated than she'd ever seen him. "So what do we do?" he asked. "Do we pretend that we don't have feelings for each other? Do we go back to being just business partners and ignore everything that's been building between us all winter?" Before Iris could answer, the phone rang with news that would make their personal crisis seem insignificant compared to the disaster that was about to engulf their entire operation. The caller was Dr. Rebecca Foster, the veterinarian who'd been treating their cattle herd, and her voice was tight with professional concern and personal sympathy. "Daniel," Dr. Foster said, "I need you to quarantine your entire herd immediately. We've just confirmed an outbreak of bovine tuberculosis at the Patterson Ranch, and according to the State Agriculture Department's tracking records, some of their cattle were pastured adjacent to your north section last fall." The implications of her words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Bovine tuberculosis was a highly contagious disease that could spread rapidly through cattle herds and jump to humans under certain conditions. If any of their cattle tested positive, the entire herd would have to be destroyed, their meat would be unsellable, and their ranch would be under quarantine for months or possibly years. But the immediate crisis was even worse than the long-term implications. They had their first group of guests arriving in less than 2 weeks, and a tuberculosis quarantine would make it impossible to offer any of the cattle-related activities that were the centerpiece of their agritourism operation. Trail rides through pastures with infected livestock, cattle drives that could spread the disease, and ranch meals featuring potentially contaminated beef would all be completely off-limits. "How long before we know for sure?" Daniel asked, his voice hollow with the realization that everything they'd worked for was potentially about to be destroyed by circumstances completely beyond their control. "Testing will take at least 2 weeks," Dr. Foster replied. "And if we find any positive cases, the quarantine and herd destruction process could take months." "I'm sorry, Daniel. I know what this ranch means to your family, and I know about the agritourism business you've been building." After Daniel hung up the phone, he and Iris sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of the crisis they were facing. All of their bookings, all of their plans, all of the money they'd invested in infrastructure and marketing, everything was suddenly at risk because of a disease outbreak that had nothing to do with their own practices or decisions. "We have to cancel everything," Iris said finally, her voice numb with shock and disappointment. "We can't bring guests to a ranch that might be under tuberculosis quarantine. Even if the tests come back negative, we can't take that risk with people's health." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding that she was right, but struggling to accept that their dreams were crumbling just when they'd seemed most achievable. "The cancellation fees alone will bankrupt us," he said, "and if the herd tests positive, we'll lose everything anyway. The ranch, the business, everything." As they sat there contemplating the destruction of everything they'd built together, Iris realized that their personal crisis had been temporarily eclipsed by something much larger and more immediate. But she also understood that how they handled this disaster would determine not just the future of their business, but the future of their relationship and their individual lives. The phone rang again, and this time it was their first group of guests. In calling to confirm their arrival details and express their excitement about experiencing authentic ranch life at the Blackwood Ranch. Iris looked at Daniel across the kitchen table, seeing her own mixture of desperation and determination reflected in his eyes, and realized that they were about to face the greatest test of their partnership yet. Everything they'd worked for was hanging in the balance. and the decisions they made in the next few hours would determine whether their impossible dream would survive or become just another cautionary tale about the dangers of reaching too high and falling too hard. The phone call that changed everything came at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late April, when the mountains were still purple with pre-dawn shadows, and the ranch was wrapped in the kind of silence that makes even whispered conversations feel like shouts. Iris was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she stared at cancellation emails and tried to calculate how much money they were going to lose when they had to refund deposits to guests who'd booked their dream vacation at a ranch that might be under indefinite quarantine. Daniel answered the phone on the second ring, his voice hoarse from another sleepless night spent wrestling with impossible decisions and unspoken feelings. "Doctor." Foster's voice crackled through the early morning air with news that neither of them had dared to hope for. "The preliminary tests are back," she said, and Iris could hear the relief in her tone, even from across the kitchen. "Your entire herd tested negative for bovine tuberculosis. We'll need to run confirmatory tests in 30 days. But as of right, now there's no evidence of infection at Blackwood Ranch." The reprieve felt like being pulled back from the edge of a cliff at the last possible moment. Daniel sat heavily in his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear, looking like a man who'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks, and finally remembered how to exhale. Iris felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized that their cattle were safe, their ranch wouldn't be quarantined, and their agritourism business might actually survive this crisis. But even as they celebrated the medical reprieve, both of them understood that they were still facing challenges that could destroy everything they'd worked for. They had less than 10 days to prepare for their first group of guests, and Jake, Morrison's drunken revelations, had poisoned the atmosphere in town in ways that wouldn't be easily repaired. Worse, the tension between them had reached a breaking point that made working together feel like navigating a minefield where every conversation carried the potential for emotional explosions. The solution came from an unexpected source. Martha Reynolds, the diner owner who'd bid against Daniel at the original auction, appeared at their front door that afternoon with a proposal that was equal parts business opportunity and peace offering. "I've been thinking about what happened with Jake Morrison," Martha said, settling into a chair at their kitchen table with the confidence of someone who'd been making hard decisions for 40 years. "Boy was drunk and stupid, but he wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. This town's full of people who don't understand what you two have built here, and they're going to keep talking until they find something else to gossip about." Iris poured coffee for all three of them, grateful for Martha's directness, but uncertain where the conversation was heading. Martha had always been known for speaking her mind, but she'd also been one of the bidders at the auction, which made her perspective on their relationship complicated at best. "The thing is," Martha continued, "I've been watching you both for the last 6 months, and what I see is two people who've created something remarkable together. That ranch of yours has been dying for years, Daniel, and now it's more alive than it's been since your grandfather's time. And Iris, you've gone from someone who looked like she'd given up on life to someone who lights up when she talks about what you're doing here." Martha leaned forward, her expression serious and intent. "But you're right to be worried about the gossip and the legal complications. People in small towns have long memories for scandal, and there's always going to be someone ready to tear down what others have built." Daniel set down his coffee mug with more force than necessary. "So what are you suggesting? That we just accept that people are going to think the worst of us no matter what we do?" "I'm suggesting that you take control of the narrative before someone else does it for you," Martha replied, "and I'm suggesting that you let me help you do it." Martha's proposal was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. She wanted to feature Blackwood Ranch as the centerpiece of a new marketing campaign for Clearwater County tourism, positioning them as an example of how traditional Montana ranching could adapt and thrive in the modern economy. The campaign would include professional photography, video testimonials, and media coverage that would tell their story on their own terms rather than letting others define it for them. But the campaign would also require complete transparency about how their partnership had begun, including the debt auction and the legal circumstances that had brought them together. Instead of hiding from the uncomfortable truth of their relationship's origins, Martha was proposing that they embrace it as a story of redemption and transformation that could inspire others facing seemingly impossible circumstances. People love comeback stories, Martha explained. They love seeing good triumph over bad circumstances, and they love believing that second chances are possible. But you have to be willing to be completely honest about where you started and how far you've come. The idea both thrilled and terrified Iris. The prospect of controlling their own narrative, of telling their story in ways that emphasize their achievements rather than their unusual beginnings, was appealing beyond measure. But it also meant exposing themselves to scrutiny and judgment on a scale they'd never experienced, opening their lives to strangers who might not understand or appreciate the complexity of their situation. Daniel was even more hesitant about Martha's proposal. The Blackwood family had always been intensely private, handling their problems internally and avoiding the kind of public attention that Martha was suggesting. The idea of turning their personal story into marketing material felt like a betrayal of everything his ancestors had stood for. "What if it backfires?" Daniel asked. "What if we open ourselves up to this kind of scrutiny and people decide that what we're doing is wrong or exploitative or fake? What if the attention destroys the very thing we're trying to protect?" Martha smiled, and Iris saw something in her expression that reminded her of her own grandmother, the kind of wisdom that comes from decades of watching people make both good and bad decisions under pressure. "Daniel," Martha said gently, "you can't protect something by hiding it forever. What you and Iris have built here is too valuable to keep secret, and it's too fragile to survive without support from people who understand what you're trying to accomplish." The decision to move forward with Martha's campaign wasn't made in a single conversation or a dramatic moment of revelation. Instead, it evolved over several days of discussion and soul-searching, as Daniel and Iris wrestled with questions that went to the heart of who they were and what they wanted their future to look like. The turning point came when they received a call from their first scheduled guests, a family from Chicago who'd been planning their Montana ranch vacation for over a year. The father, David Chen, was a surgeon who'd been working 80-hour weeks and desperately needed time to reconnect with his wife and 2 teenage daughters. When he called to confirm their reservation, his excitement and anticipation were so genuine that Iris felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical force. "My daughters have never seen mountains or ridden horses or experienced anything like what you're offering," David told her. "This trip represents everything I've been working toward for the last 10 years. I want to give my family memories that will last a lifetime, and I believe that what you've created at Blackwood Ranch is exactly what we need." After that phone call, Iris understood that their decision about Martha's marketing campaign wasn't really about them anymore. It was about all the families like the Chens who were looking for authentic experiences that would enrich their lives and strengthen their relationships. It was about preserving a way of life that was disappearing from America, and about proving that traditional values could coexist with modern realities. "We have to take the risk," Iris told Daniel that evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset behind the mountains. "We have to trust that people will see the truth of what we've built here, even if they don't understand how we got started." Daniel was quiet for a long time, studying the landscape that represented 4 generations of his family's dreams and sacrifices. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of their lives. "My great-great-grandmother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. I think she'd understand what we're trying to do here, and I think she'd want us to fight for it." The professional photography session took place over 3 days in early May, just a week before their first guests were scheduled to arrive. The photographer, a woman named Elena Rodriguez, who specialized in agricultural and rural lifestyle images, had driven up from Denver specifically to capture what Martha described as the soul of modern Montana ranching. Elena approached the project with an artist's eye and a journalist's instinct for story. She photographed Daniel working with the cattle at sunrise, his silhouette backlit by golden mountain light that made him look like a figure from a Western painting. She captured Iris in the renovated bunkhouse, arranging wildflowers in mason jars and preparing rooms that would welcome guests from around the world. But the most powerful images were the ones that showed them working together, Daniel and Iris, moving cattle through mountain pastures, preparing meals in the ranch kitchen, sitting on the front porch, planning activities for their upcoming guests. In Elena's photographs, their partnership looked natural and balanced, 2 people who complemented each other's strengths and shared a vision that was bigger than either of them could have achieved alone. The photo session also gave them an opportunity to practice telling their story in ways that emphasized transformation rather than exploitation, hope rather than desperation. Elena interviewed them extensively about their backgrounds, their partnership, and their vision for the future of Blackwood Ranch. "What I find most compelling about your story," Elena told them during a break in the photography, "is how you've taken circumstances that could have been tragic and turned them into something beautiful and meaningful. You've created a business that preserves traditions while embracing change, and you've built a partnership that proves people can rise above their circumstances when they're given genuine opportunities." The interview process helped Iris articulate feelings and insights that she'd been struggling with since the debt auction 8 months earlier. For the first time, she was able to see her own journey not as a series of unfortunate events that had happened to her, but as choices she'd made to survive, adapt, and ultimately thrive in circumstances that would have defeated many people. "I spent a long time thinking that being sold at that auction was the worst thing that could happen to me," Iris said during one of Elena's recorded interviews. "But I realize now that it was actually the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because the auction itself was good, but because it brought me to a place where I could discover capabilities I never knew I had and build something meaningful with someone who saw my potential when I couldn't see it myself." Daniel's interviews revealed a man who'd been carrying the weight of family expectations and financial pressure for years before Iris arrived at the ranch. His decision to bid at the auction hadn't been impulsive or opportunistic. It had been the culmination of months of soul-searching about what kind of person he wanted to be and what legacy he wanted to leave. "I could have let someone else win that auction," Daniel told Elena. "I could have walked away and minded my own business, but my family built this ranch on the principle that you help people when you can, especially when they can't help themselves." Iris didn't need rescuing. She needed opportunity. And it turns out that giving her that opportunity saved me as much as it helped her. The marketing campaign launched just as their first guests arrived, creating a perfect storm of media attention and real-world testing of their hospitality systems. David Chen and his family from Chicago became unwitting ambassadors for the Blackwood Ranch experience, sharing their enthusiasm on social media and providing testimonials that reinforced everything Martha's campaign was trying to communicate. But The real test came when a reporter from the Billings Gazette arrived unannounced, having heard about the ranch through the marketing campaign and wanting to investigate the story behind the success. Sarah Mitchell was an investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering uncomfortable truths that people preferred to keep hidden, and her arrival at the ranch sent both Daniel and Iris into a state of controlled panic. "I'm here because I've heard some interesting things about how this partnership began," Sarah told them during an impromptu interview on the front porch. "I understand that Ms. McKenna was acquired through a debt auction, which raises questions about labor practices and the voluntary nature of your business relationship." The moment Iris had been dreading since Martha first proposed the marketing campaign had finally arrived. She was being directly challenged about the circumstances that had brought her to the ranch, and her answer would determine not just how their story was told in the press, but how she understood her own journey from desperation to empowerment. "You're right that I came here through a debt auction," Iris said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "That's not a secret we've been trying to hide. But what you might not understand is that being here has been a choice I've made every single day for the last 8 months. She looked directly at the reporter, drawing strength from Daniel's presence beside her and from the knowledge that everything she was about to say was absolutely true. "I could leave tomorrow if I wanted to," Iris continued. "Daniel has never used the legal contract to control or manipulate me. He's honored every commitment he made to me, and he's given me opportunities to grow and succeed that I never would have had anywhere else. This partnership works because we both bring value to it, not because one of us owns the other." Sarah Mitchell pressed harder, asking pointed questions about power dynamics, financial arrangements, and the perception that Iris was being exploited regardless of her own feelings about the situation. But with each question, Iris found herself more confident and articulate in defending not just their partnership, but her own agency and decision-making capacity. The interview lasted 2 hours and covered every aspect of their relationship, their business, and their individual backgrounds. When it was over, both Daniel and Iris felt like they'd been through a trial by fire that had tested their resolve and clarified their understanding of what they'd built together. Sarah Mitchell's article appeared in the Billings Gazette 3 days later, and its impact exceeded even Martha's most optimistic projections. Instead of the exposé that Daniel and Iris had feared, the article was a nuanced portrait of two people who'd found ways to transform personal and economic trauma into something positive and meaningful. The headline read, "From Auction Block to Business Partnership, How Two Unlikely Allies Are Redefining Montana Ranching." And the article went on to describe their operation as an example of how traditional industries could adapt to modern challenges while maintaining their essential character and values. But more importantly, the article positioned Iris not as a victim of circumstances, but as an entrepreneur who'd seized an unusual opportunity and turned it into success through hard work, intelligence, and determination. It acknowledged the uncomfortable origins of their partnership while emphasizing the mutual respect and shared vision that had made their collaboration successful. The response to the article was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Booking requests flooded in from guests who wanted to experience what the article described as authentic Montana hospitality with a modern twist. Tourism boards from neighboring counties reached out about featuring Blackwood Ranch in regional marketing campaigns. Most significantly, other debt auction survivors contacted them, asking for advice about how to transform their own circumstances into opportunities for advancement. As spring turned to summer and their guest season reached full swing, Iris realized that they'd achieved something remarkable. They'd taken the worst day of her life, that courthouse auction where she'd been sold to pay debts that weren't her fault, and transformed it into the foundation for a life that exceeded anything she'd ever imagined possible. But even as their business success exceeded all expectations, the personal tension between Daniel and Iris continued to simmer beneath the surface of their professional partnership. His confession of love on that terrible night, when everything seemed to be falling apart, had changed the dynamic between them in ways that neither of them knew how to navigate. The resolution of that tension would determine not just the future of their romantic relationship, but the long-term sustainability of the partnership that had become the center of both their lives. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in late August, delivered by certified mail to the Blackwood Ranch with the kind of official weight that immediately commanded attention. Iris signed for it while Daniel was out checking the irrigation system, and she knew from the return address, the law offices of Harrison, Mitchell and Associates, that this was the moment they'd both been anticipating and dreading for months. Inside was a single sheet of legal letterhead containing a document that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both their lives. The letter was brief, formal, and life-changing. Debt satisfaction and contract termination for Iris McKenna. After 8 months of partnership, after transforming a failing ranch into a thriving agritourism operation, after building something together that neither of them could have achieved alone, Iris's debt had been fully satisfied through the success of their business venture. She was free, legally, completely, unconditionally free. The irony wasn't lost on her that freedom had come not through the passage of time or the completion of her required labor, but through the very success that had made her indentured servitude irrelevant. Their business had generated enough profit to satisfy her original debt 3 years ahead of schedule, and the legal contract that had bound her to Daniel Blackwood no longer had any force or meaning. Iris sat at the kitchen table holding the letter, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows that she'd cleaned, in a kitchen where she'd prepared thousands of meals, in a house that had become more of a home to her than anywhere she'd ever lived. The document in her hands represented everything she'd dreamed of during those dark months before the auction: the restoration of her legal autonomy, the end of her obligation to another person, the freedom to make choices about her future without considering anyone else's needs or desires. So why did freedom feel so terrifying when Daniel returned from the fields an hour later, sweaty and tired from wrestling with a broken irrigation valve? He found Iris still sitting at the table with the letter spread out in front of her like evidence in a trial where she was both judge and jury. "What's that?" he asked, though something in her posture already told him that their carefully constructed world was about to shift in ways that neither of them could control. "My debt is satisfied," Iris said simply, sliding the letter across the table to him. "According to this, I've been legally free for the last 2 weeks. The lawyer just needed time to file the paperwork with the court." Daniel read the document twice, his expression carefully neutral in the way that Iris had learned meant he was processing information that was too complex or emotionally charged to react to immediately. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes held a mixture of emotions that she couldn't fully decipher. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "This is what you've been working toward since the day we met." The words were correct and appropriate, but they carried an undertone of loss that made Iris's chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to examine. Daniel was genuinely happy for her freedom, but he was also bracing himself for the possibility that freedom would mean the end of everything they'd built together. "What happens now?" Iris asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Daniel set the letter down and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the ranch that had been transformed over the past 8 months from a struggling cattle operation into something that resembled the tourism destination they'd envisioned during those long winter nights of planning and dreaming. The guest accommodations were full for the next 6 weeks, with reservations extending into October, and early bookings already coming in for the following year. Their reputation had spread far beyond Sarah Mitchell's newspaper article, generating coverage in travel magazines and lifestyle blogs that positioned Blackwood Ranch as a premier destination for authentic Western experiences. More importantly, they'd achieved something that went beyond business success. They'd created an operation that honored the ranch's 4-generation history while adapting to contemporary realities, preserving traditional ranching culture while making it accessible and relevant to people from completely different backgrounds and experiences. "I guess that depends on what you want to do," Daniel said, still facing the window. "You're free to go anywhere, do anything. You could start your own business, go back to school, move to a city where there are more opportunities. For someone with your skills." He turned around to face her, and Iris saw in his expression the same vulnerability that had been there on that terrible night when he'd confessed his feelings for her, when everything had seemed to be falling apart and he'd risked destroying their partnership by admitting that it had become something more than professional collaboration. "Or," Daniel continued, his voice careful and measured, "you could stay. Not because you have to, not because there's a legal contract that requires it, but because you choose to, because you want to keep building what we've started here." The offer hung between them like a bridge that she could either cross or burn, and Iris realized that this moment represented the most important decision of her life. Not because of its practical implications. She'd already proven that she could succeed in the hospitality and tourism industry, but because it would define who she was and who she wanted to become. For 8 months, she'd been able to tell herself that she was staying at the ranch because she had no choice, that her partnership with Daniel was a matter of legal obligation rather than personal preference. The debt satisfaction document had stripped away that comfortable fiction, forcing her to confront the truth about her own feelings and desires. What would staying look like, she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Daniel walked back to the table and sat down across from her, the same position they'd occupied during hundreds of conversations about business plans and guest schedules and equipment purchases. But this conversation was different because it was about them, about the future they might build together if they were both brave enough to admit what they wanted. It would look like a real partnership, Daniel said. Equal ownership, equal decision-making authority, equal share of profits and risks. It would mean taking your name off the employee paperwork and putting it on the property deed. It would mean that this ranch belongs to both of us, not just legally, but in every way that matters. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture that had sent electricity through both of them during those early months when they were still figuring out how to work together without acknowledging the attraction that was building between them. And it would mean that we stop pretending that this is just a business relationship, Daniel continued, his voice softer now, but more intense. It would mean admitting that what we've built here is more than a successful enterprise. It's a life, Iris. It's the kind of life that I never thought I'd be lucky enough to have, and I don't want to lose it just because a piece of paper says you don't have to stay anymore. Iris felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The ranch had become her home, not because she'd been forced to accept it, but because it was the first place where she'd been valued for her contributions rather than pitied for her circumstances. Daniel had become more than her business partner. More than the man who'd rescued her from a desperate situation. He'd become the person who believed in her potential when she couldn't see it herself, who challenged her to grow and change and become someone stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. "I'm scared," Iris admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never had real choices before, never had the freedom to make decisions based on what I wanted instead of what I had to do to survive. What if I make the wrong choice? What if I stay for the wrong reasons or leave for the wrong reasons? Daniel's grip on her hand tightened, not possessively but reassuringly, the touch of someone who understood that the most important decisions are often the most frightening ones. There are no wrong reasons, he said. There are only honest reasons and dishonest ones. The question isn't whether staying or leaving is objectively right or wrong. The question is what feels true to who you are and who you want to become. Iris looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their operation, seeing not just the physical space, but the memories layered within it. Late-night planning sessions when they dreamed about possibilities that seemed impossible. Early morning coffee before heading out to work with the cattle or prepare for incoming guests. Quiet dinners after long days when they'd been too tired to talk but comfortable enough in each other's presence that silence felt like conversation. She thought about the guests who'd stayed with them over the summer. Families from cities who'd never experienced the kind of authentic hospitality that she and Daniel provided together. She remembered the letters they'd received from people whose vacations at Blackwood Ranch had become treasured family memories, proof that what they'd created together had value that extended far beyond profit margins and business success. Most importantly, she thought about the woman she'd become over the past 8 months, the confident, capable person who could manage complex logistics, solve problems under pressure, and create experiences that enriched other people's lives. That woman had emerged not despite her circumstances, but because of them, not in spite of her partnership with Daniel, but because of it. I know what I want, Iris said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I want to stay, not because I have to, not because I'm grateful for being rescued, but because this is where I belong. This ranch, this business, this life we've built. Together. It's mine as much as it's yours, and I'm not ready to walk away from something that we created together. Daniel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming his entire face with relief and joy, and something deeper that Iris finally recognized as love that had been held in check for months by circumstances and timing, and the fear of destroying something precious by wanting too much too soon. There's something else I want, Iris continued, feeling braver now that she'd committed to staying, ready to risk everything on the possibility that the feelings she'd been fighting were mutual and real, and worth the vulnerability that came with admitting them. I want to find out what happens when two people who've been afraid to trust their feelings finally stop being afraid. I want to discover whether what we've built as partners can become something even better as more than partners. Daniel stood up from his chair and walked around the table to where she sat, extending his hand to her with the same gesture he'd used 8 months ago when he'd helped her down from the courthouse platform. But this time, she wasn't taking his hand because she had no other choice. She was taking it because she wanted to, because she was choosing him and the life they could build together. Iris McKenna, Daniel said, his voice formal and playful at the same time. Would you like to be my partner in every sense of the word? Would you like to help me run this ranch not as my employee or my obligation, but as my equal and my whatever? It comes after partner when partner isn't a big enough word anymore? Yes, Iris said, standing up and stepping closer to him, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough that when he cupped her face in his calloused hands it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been but had always been looking for. Yes to all of it. Yes to the ranch. Yes to the partnership. Yes to finding out what comes after partner. When Daniel kissed her, it tasted like freedom and choice and the kind of future that's built on mutual respect rather than legal obligation. It tasted like the coffee they'd shared during 1,000 morning conversations and the Montana air they'd breathed while working side by side through every season of challenge and growth. 6 months later, on a perfect October morning, when the aspens were gold against the mountain sky, Daniel and Iris were married on the front porch of the ranch house, surrounded by guests who'd become friends and neighbors who'd become family. Martha Reynolds catered the reception. Elena Rodriguez photographed the ceremony, and Sarah Mitchell wrote a follow-up article titled, "From Business Partners to Life Partners, The Blackwood Ranch Love Story." But the real story wasn't the wedding or the media coverage or even the continued success of their agritourism operation. The real story was simpler and more profound. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances had chosen to build something beautiful together, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. As Iris danced with her husband on the porch where they'd spent countless evenings planning their impossible dream, she realized that the best part of freedom wasn't the ability to leave. It was the power to choose to stay, to commit, to build a future based on love rather than obligation. The Blackwood Ranch continued to thrive, but more importantly, so did the people who transformed it from a struggling cattle operation into proof that sometimes the most broken situations can become the foundation for the most beautiful lives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.